Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. The classical scholar Victor Davis Hanson, a fellow at the Hoover Institution, is the author of more than a dozen books, including Carnage and Culture, The Western Way of War, and most recently, the father of us all, War and History. Also a fellow at the Hoover Institution, Peter Berkowitz is a political scientist and a scholar of constitutional law. He contributes frequently to the Weekly Standard and the Wall Street Journal. Victor, Peter, welcome. Segment 1, What Just Happened? In Tunisia, on December 17th, a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi protested the harassment he had suffered at the hands of local police by committing suicide, setting himself ablaze. Since then, the governments of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, president of Tunisia for 23 years, and of Hosni Mubarak, president of Egypt for some 30 years, have been overthrown. A civil war has broken out in Libya. The king of Jordan has dismissed his cabinet, and protests have taken place in Bahrain, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. Victor, how do we understand this?
Well, there's two things going on. One is we live in an age of Facebook, Twitter, internet, so something that would be local in Tunisia now resonates all over the world. And in the case of the Middle East, whether it's monarchy, theocracy, military dictatorship, or thugocracy, as you see in Libya, they all have one common denominator. They deny people freedom, they've ruined the economy, and they've stolen from the people. And there's been this seething anger, and in some part, the demonstration of democracy in Iraq was a model, and what would have been a local prairie fire and turned into a conflagration.
Peter, contrast what's taking place in the Arab world in 2011 with the Velvet Revolution, the anti-communist revolution that swept Eastern Europe in 1989.
What you have in the Arab world today, for one thing, you have the impact of Islam, which of course we didn't have in the European revolutions, and we really don't know what the consequence is going to be. One of the developments in recent months that you left out, very important, is what happened in Lebanon, which is that Hezbollah took control of the Lebanese government.
Hezbollah is?
Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranian Republican Guard. It's a movement committed to bringing all of Lebanon under Sharia law and to indefinite resistance against what it regards as the Israeli invaders in Israel, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but in all of Israel, the Jewish government of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel. So Hezbollah has taken over the government of Lebanon, ousted a pro-Western prime minister by the name of Saad Hariri, and installed what looks to be a Hezbollah puppet who is certainly good friends with the Syrians. This is a tremendous threat to freedom. So what you had in Europe was a clear and definite overthrowing of the alternative to Western-style liberal democracy and a clear determination to embrace Western-style liberal democracy. What we see in the Arab Middle East is a definite determination to get rid of authoritarian dictators, partly because as people are living in grinding poverty. What we don't know in this case is what the people want.
Let's stay with a moment for Egypt, because it's overwhelmingly the largest in population, 85 million in population, historically the center of the Arab world, cultural center of the Arab world. The historian Bernard Lewis noted in a recent interview that the Arab world has no history of democracy. 1,300 years of Muslim in the Arab world has produced zero democracies, except for the 1970s in Lebanon, and the Christian minority played a central role in that brief democracy. All right, Bernard Lewis, quote, "In Egypt, the religious parties have an immediate advantage. First, they have a network of communication through the preacher and the mosque, which no other political tendency can hope to equal. Second, they use familiar language. The language of Western democracies, for the most part, newly translated and not intelligible to the great masses. In genuinely fair and free elections, the Muslim parties are likely to win, and I think that would be a disaster." Close quote. Victor, what's going to happen in Egypt?
I don't think we know, but we have a lot of paradoxes that are going on in the region. One is that these odious dictators like Mubarak tend to be more liberal in classical terms than the population. So if we were to have a plebiscite, the people might reflect a level of religious intolerance, anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, oppression against women that would not be true of the Mubarak government, despite its horrific human rights record. Another paradox we have in the region is that it's unlike Eastern Europe, where they were rebelling against a monolithic communism. They all had that in common, these various Eastern European countries who did have some experience with democracy in the 20s and 30s. Here we have these a potpourri, Iranian theocracy, Libya's crazy authoritarianism, Mubarak's pro-American military dictatorship, the Ba'ath Party in Syria. And so when we look at this situation, what's lacking on the part of the Obama administration is a principled, clear-cut, consistent support for constitutional, consensual government, independent judiciary, human rights, secular, transition without violence, and apply that blueprint. Instead, what we hear is Mubarak, a dictator. Mubarak's not a dictator. He should have gone yesterday, should have gone today, should go tomorrow, should be a transition. Muslim Brotherhood, okay, secular, nonviolent. And the result of that, how it distills is, take last June in Iran, Obama apologizes for the Mossadegh incident and says, I'm not going to meddle in the internal affairs. Libya, a week and he's voting present for various reasons. Nevertheless, he's not expressing concern. And then finally he says, I think Mr. Gaddafi should go. That's like Churchill saying, I think Mr. Hitler should go. Of course he should go. But what are you going to do about it?
Segment 2, other than Egypt. Let me just go through some nations. You give me a sentence on each one, a sentence or two. Libya, population 6 million. As we tape this, the country appears to be broken in two. Rebels against Gaddafi seem to have captured the eastern half, roughly, of the country. Gaddafi's still in charge in Tripoli, in the capital. What's the outcome?
As Victor said, we don't know what the outcome is. We know Libya is important. 10% of Europe's oil comes from Libya. We know that Libya is a heavily tribal-based society, and it certainly, as Victor has suggested, it hasn't got any experience of democracy. The road to democracy, which is the road that we should all be on and aspire to, it's going to be a long, hard trek there.
Tunisia, population about 10.5 million, still has no government, even though the president fled. Mm-hmm. What's going on there?
I'm a little bit more confident about Tunisia because it has elements of a secular society. It's got a good tourist industry. It's got closer ties with Europe. There's an aspiring upper middle class there, and it doesn't have a history of violence as does places like Libya and Algeria.
So Tunisia's okay sooner or later.
I think so.
It's kind of full middle class, which is another way to put it a little more generally. It's got more of the conditions that conduce to freedom.
Jordan, monarchy. Population of between 6 and 7 million. What's going on? And the king has dismissed his cabinet. There have been some protests. It doesn't have the feeling of something that's about to explode, though.
No, but the king has got a restive Palestinian population. It's always been a problem in Jordan. The king's, relative to these other countries, the king's in a pretty good position, but he's certainly got his work cut out for him. It's
and
not
as you get closer to Israel, the matter gets more complex. Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco,
way off in North Africa,
and the Gulf.
right.
But when you get right as a borderline state, you don't want to replicate the conditions that you had prior to 1973. Anytime Israel has a belligerent in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, there's a war because it's strategically advantageous. So we're getting to a point where one could envision if something were to happen in Egypt or Jordan, we would have the exact conditions we had on the eve of the Yom Kippur War.
I'll come to Israel in a moment, but just two more countries, one tiny, one big. Bahrain, tiny little country, little island, population of just over 1 million people, but it's the base for the United States 5th Fleet. What happens in Bahrain?
Again, we don't know what happens there. It's deeply problematic. Iran keeps making claims for it, but as you know, it's connected by a long causeway to Saudi Arabia. It's got a very significant Shiite population. It's very unstable. A lot to worry about
which
there.
leads to Saudi Arabia. Population of 27 million and about a quarter of the world's oil production.
Well, they've had this very strange paradox, whereas they thought they could assuage popular unrest by being more Islamic than Islamic radicals, and at the same time,
short of Iran, it is the most Islamic.
A Sunni
state.
version of an Islamic state, but distributing the money much better under somewhat capitalist auspices and American tutelage and help. But the problem we have with Saudi Arabia is it's a no-win situation, because it supplies so much oil for the world, and it was anti-communist, and yet it's always played a duplicitous role with subsidizing terrorists as long as they turn their venom against us.
Can you explain something? This has puzzled me for a long time. Go all the way back to the first Gulf War. Saddam invades Kuwait. Who's extremely nervous? Whose oil fields are next up? Those of Saudi Arabia. The United States of America puts in several 100,000 troops at vast, almost unimaginable expense, billions and billions of dollars, pushes Saddam out. We base our troops in Saudi Arabia.
And keeps Saddam Hussein in, because the Saudis do not want a popular government or a Shiite-dominated government.
In brief, we saved the Saudis' bacon.
Absolutely.
They continue to fund the expansion of, what is the name of the extremely conservative sect?
Wahhabism.
Wahhabism. They continue to fund Wahhabism around the world, including in the United States.
The Saudis face two threats. They face external threats from which they need our protection. They face the internal threat of radical Islam. In order to buy off radical Islam, they use their tremendous, incalculable economic wealth in order to become either they are one or Iran is one, it's not clear, number one exporter of the teachings of radical Islam. They export the Sunni version, Iran exports the Shia version. But they do it.
And we put up with it. Why?
Because we have this thing called they. You said they. Who's they, as they say in the Wild Bunch? 7,000 members of the royal family? Well, here's how it works. 1,000 of them freelance and give money to bin Laden. They give money to Dr. Zawahiri. They give money to the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the official close circle that deals with us has a deniability of culpability. We haven't done it. We don't know anything about it. And that's the way that government works. It works elsewhere in the Middle East as well. So we cannot hold Saudi Arabia responsible. We've tried. We've said, look, the money's coming from Saudi Arabia, and they say, it's a rogue prince, it's a cousin we don't like any more than you do. Radical Islam is just as much a threat to us. And then privately, when we're out of the picture, they said, you know what? Keep giving money to terrorists so they don't turn their attention to us.
But I repeat the question, why do we put up with it? Because if Victor knows what's going on, if Victor knows they're playing a shell game with princes, surely we know they're playing a shell game with princes. We know that, and we know one other thing about Saudi Arabia. They know how to find and take care of dissidents. Mm-hmm. They know how to keep control of that country. Therefore, they know how to keep control of those princes who are playing games against us.
They pump 9 million barrels of oil per day. And that's not just that they export.
So we are hostage to the oil, essentially.
Yeah. Well, it's not just our supply, it's also the capital that earns. And it floats around the world financial market. So if you really, you don't, I guess I'm not a big fan of our policy towards Saudi Arabia, but I guess it was predicated on the idea we don't want a Sunni version of Iran next to a Shiite Iran, and together 11 million barrels with all of this money and all of this influence and leverage and corruption of Europe and the United States. And it corrupts us too. Remember, we have all sorts of people who have financial interest.
And we have to make clear this is not just a matter of how much money they accumulate and our dependence on their nearly 25% of the world's proven oil reserves. The international economy grinds to a halt if the flow of Saudi oil stops. That means China, that means India, that means Japan, that means Europe. It's not because 17% or so of our energy comes from there. It's because Saudi Arabia holds the world hostage. That is a very sad fact of contemporary political life.
Segment 3, Twitter to freedom. One of the principal figures in the Egyptian revolution was a young Google an Egyptian, but he had trained in this country and made a lot of money. He's a working Google executive. Protesters throughout the Arab world have been in touch on Twitter. They're keeping in touch by email. They're posting events on YouTube. Is what has taken place conceivable without the high tech? Is the political revolution we're witnessing now conceivable absent the high-tech revolution of the last decade and a half or so, the communications revolution?
I don't think so, but I think we're seeing the veneer of the revolution. I think that the radical Islamicists know about social networking and electronic information, and so does the westernized upper and smaller middle class, and they galvanize people. But to the degree that somebody who's a peasant farmer in a village on the Nile is getting up every morning and looking at Twitter, I'm dubious that that's happening. So what I'm suggesting is that they caused the initial revolt, they got rid of Mubarak, and now the social networking may or may not be effective. What's going to capture the majority are people listening in the mosque, people turning on state-run television, people getting a little bit more mundane messages who don't participate. It's almost everybody in Washington and New York and at Harvard, Yale, they do Twitter and Facebook, but people out in Fresno or out working in a factory, they're not Twittering every day.
Peter?
The way I put it is that the rise of the internet, email, social networking is very much a double-edged sword. In this country, the great beneficiary in the 2008 election was the Obama campaign, which expertly used social networking. In the last 2 years, the real beneficiary of the new technology has been the Tea Party movement. It's neutral, it's a double-edged sword, and just as Victor says, the Muslim Brotherhood, the forces of radical Islam, they not only know how to use them, they are using them very effectively even as we speak.
We have no margin of error, it's just an accelerator, a catalyst. So all these movements may have happened, but they're happening at lightning speed now.
Peter, question. We know that one of the aims of at least some branches of the radical Islamic movement is a restoration of the caliphate. All right, what are they talking about? They're talking about something like a predecessor to, but something like, well, you can glimpse it most recently in 1918, the day before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And what you see when you look at a map is all kinds of places that we now think of as nations simply didn't exist. Iraq wasn't there. There was no border. Lebanon wasn't there. Israel wasn't there. Egypt wasn't. It was an undistinguished region. All right. So the question here is, does the new communications technology tend to play into this dream of a restoration, of somehow transcending or eliminating the nation state, which is an artifact of the 20th century, and play into the dream of a pan-Arab movement?
For sure. Just as Western progressive liberal internationalists are delighted by the rise of the internet because they think it helps lay the foundations for a one-state world and global governance, and there's some reason for that.
It does tend to act as a solvent of the nation state.
And by the way, just as Marx thought, as said in the Communist Manifesto, that the rise of telegraph helped lay the foundations for universal revolution of the proletariat, so too the radical Islamists certainly use this technology in the hope that it is laying the foundation for, by the way, the caliphate, we can be even more precise. The caliphate means a single government under Islam, under all territories that have previously been held by Islam. In other words, stretching from Spain in the west to somewhere beyond Iran in the east. One government, and it's a Muslim government. That is what the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is committed to.
Victor, let me. New York Times in February, quote, officials responded with a mass show of force across China after anonymous calls for protesters to stage a Chinese Jasmine revolution went out over social media and microblogging outlets. The words Jasmine revolution, borrowed from the successful Tunisian revolt, were blocked on sites similar to Twitter and internet search engines. In recent days, more than a dozen lawyers and rights activists have been rounded up, and more than 80 dissidents have reportedly been placed under varying forms of house arrest, close quote. Why do all three of us know that the Chinese won't let it happen?
Because they're willing to use a level of coercion that essentially says to the West, we don't really care what you say, you have no influence over us. And if I could be blunt, you're borrowing $1 trillion for health care when 400 million of us have never seen a Western doctor, so don't give us any lectures because you have no influence over us. I would say, though, that on your interest about the caliphate, I don't see a monolithic Muslim nation appearing, because it's no more monolithic than the EU, and the EU is shattering as we speak. And the idea that Canada and the United States and Britain are going to have an Anglosphere again is ridiculous. There's so many fissures within the Arab world: Shia, Sunni, Alawite, tribal, geographical, economic systems. And remember, for all of the PC anti-Americanism, Saddam Hussein and Khomeini, and throw in Hafez al-Assad and Libya, have killed more of their own people than we did in Iraq and the first Gulf War, trying to liberate them.
Yes, sure.
If I may say so, I think that Victor is right. The likelihood of a caliphate emerging is extremely remote. However, it is a real aspiration of lots of people and lots of leaders, and it's reasonable to worry that there will be a great deal of death and destruction as these people unsuccessfully seek to bring about a caliphate.
Segment 4, Israel. Israel has this much of a border with Lebanon, this much of a border with Syria, but this much of a border with Egypt. You've just come back from Israel. What is the thinking in Israel about the meaning of this Arab revolution for Israel?
Needless to say, the Israelis are very concerned. The wisest among the Israelis make clear that when people cry out for freedom and democracy, Israel should stand with them. But they also make clear, concerning the people in Egypt, that's a long-term aspiration. The path to freedom and democracy might be very bumpy for the Egyptians and very dangerous for the Israelis. In terms of actual threats, the Israelis don't fear conventional warfare. The army is close.
Tanks are not going to roll across the Sinai.
They're not going to roll across the Sinai. It's a long way across the desert, and those tanks are extremely vulnerable to the Israeli Air Force. However, so that is not a short-term or intermediate-term threat. What is the near-term threat is even worse security in the Sinai Peninsula than the security provided by Hosni Mubarak's regime. Every single missile and every single rocket, and there are now missiles in the Gaza Strip, Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, there are real missiles, not crummy rockets, real missiles that can reach Tel Aviv, which you can aim, which explode in the air, which will kill hundreds or thousands of people. Every single armament in the Gaza Strip got there from Iran through the Sinai Peninsula. If the smuggled in illegally with the help of Bedouins, maybe Egyptian forces were bribed. Right. Yes, all of this. If this security breaks down even more, this is a tremendously significant threat to Israel. Moreover, it's not just Gaza. Israel, I think, as you already described, shares a long border, Sinai Peninsula. There's no force there. There's no a security barrier there. There's a very serious threat of greater infiltration through the Sinai Peninsula into Israel. It's very worrisome from an Israeli point of view.
Victor?
Any time in history that you've had Syria and Egypt both bellicose, you've had a war with Israel, every time. The only reason we haven't had the same type of war is because Egypt was out of the picture. And I agree with Peter that we're not thinking of a 1967 or 73 war, but if one were to total up the missile arsenal of whether they're Katuskas or Scuds or whatever they are, and you count them in Lebanon and Shia-occupied Lebanon, in Syria, on the West Bank, controlled by Hamas and Gaza, and if you were to add to that equation on the Egyptian border, and then you were to look at the damage that suicide bombers did coming through Gaza, and you were to multiply that through terrorist bands coming in, insurgencies, things like that, you could really damage Israel as a sophisticated modern society very quickly by putting half the population in shelters and then having people come across the border, shoot people, commit acts of terrorism, not from one side, but from all sides. So that's what they're worried about, and they have reason to be, given their history.
In this roundup of what's taking place in Arab nations, I didn't mention Syria, and I realized I didn't mention Syria because I haven't read much about Syria. What's taking place in Syria?
Well, officially, we're still making outreach. This new reset diplomacy started with the proposition that all our problems with Syria did not transcend George Bush. He started it. He was mean to them. He didn't have diplomatic relations to them. Barack Hussein Obama, as he said in his Al Arabiya interview, because of his father's religion and because of his multicultural fides, he was going to reach out to Syria, moderate its behavior. Nobody had ever tried that, he thought, although they had. And what's the result of that policy? We had to pressure Israel about settlements. We got nothing in turn from Syria, and now we're in this, embarrassing situation where we're pressuring Mubarak on human rights, and a far greater offender, a regime, remember, whose father wiped out Hama, 10, 20,000 people slaughtered, was caught by the Israelis developing nuclear facilities. And we haven't said a word.
And there's no democracy movement in Syria.
Why isn't he next? Why doesn't Barack Obama say, would you please step down, Mr. Assad?
Peter, you've just come back from Israel. I've never been to Israel, I'm embarrassed to admit.
I have to bring you.
I'd love to visit. Over the last decade, roughly, correct my timing, as best I can tell, there have been two big trends in Israel. One is tremendous economic buoyancy. That is a happening place. Lots of high technology, levels of education, the sense of simply leading a good life is everywhere to be seen. Trend one. Trend two, things have gotten more and more and more dangerous. Iran in pursuit of nuclear weapons under a leader who has spoken openly about driving Israel into the sea. Turkish government becoming more Islamic and supporting that fleet of civilian ships that attempted to break the Gaza blockade. Now we have the victory of Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have now unrest and uncertainty in Egypt. The two Arab countries that have made peace, Egypt, government overturned. Jordan, king under pressure, let's put it that way. At a minimum, we have the king under pressure. I am reminded that all three of us know and admire him. We have our differences from him as well, but all three of us know and admire Christopher Hitchens.
Indeed.
And I am reminded that in his memoir, Hitch 22, he wrote that he could never quite bring himself to believe that Israel looked permanent. What about this sense, just looking at it objectively, doesn't one have the sense that the existential moment is approaching? How does Israel cope with that? I'm delighted to see that brings a smile to your face.
Yes, well, I wish I could tell you how they cope with it, where they find the fortitude. Of course, you see there is a kind of schizophrenia in Israel. As your description is absolutely right. Extraordinary prosperity. Tel Aviv and the greater Tel Aviv area has become one of the great Mediterranean beach towns that there is. At the same time, you hear a term among national security people and ordinary citizens that I didn't used to hear, and that is, and speaking about Iran, a threat to our very existence, an existential threat. All the previous wars, with the exception of the War of Independence, were fought outside Israel. Well, it's very close to Israel, but urban areas, popular areas were not targeted. What's going to be different, and it already began to be different with the 2006 Second Lebanon War, is that all the enemies you mentioned, even Hamas, Hezbollah in the south, have real missiles, intermediate range missiles that will reach Tel Aviv. They will do terrible damage.
Segment 5. The United States. Victor, historian Neil Ferguson, quote, President Obama faced, this is going back a couple of weeks, stark alternatives. He could lend his support to the youthful revolutionaries, or he could do nothing and let the forces of reaction prevail. He did both. Some days exhorting Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to leave, other days drawing back and recommending an orderly transition. The result has been a foreign policy debacle. The president has alienated everybody, not only Mubarak's cronies in the military, but also the youthful crowds in the streets of Cairo, and America's two closest friends in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are both disgusted. Close quote. He's going over the top a little, don't you think?
No, I don't. I agree with him, because what he's doing is he carefully, as a lot of us did, collated what Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton said over an 18-day period to how they address the Egyptian situation, the relative silence about Libya, and he's also collating what happened in Iran in 2009, the idea, this sermon about meddling in internal affairs, and then the silence about Syria, and then some gratuitous remarks about Tunisia, and you put it all together, and one wants to know, is the United States pressuring governments that are autocratic, kind of, sort of, but not until they think that the demonstration is going to succeed? Or do they have a principle of support for human rights, democracy, constitutionality, legality, independent judiciary? Can't see it. We don't have any broad principles that we apply to everybody. So what is the policy now? The policy is this. If there is a monarchy and there is a theocracy and there's a military dictatorship or there's a brutal savage Ba'athist or whatever they are, and their people revolt against them, we do this. And we wait and we try to see what are the chances that the people in the street are going to prevail. And if we, at some critical mass, when they prevail, then we're going to go back and support them, and then retroactively we're going to say, we always did say that we supported you. And if they look like they're going to fail or they're quiet, then we back off and say we want to transition or quiet. And then there's one other policy, and this is why Neil Ferguson is so upset. And the other policy I alluded to earlier. If you say that you cannot meddle in Iranian affairs, and if you say that this horrific regime in Syria, we have to reach out, as we did not in the Bush administration, and if you don't say anything about utter savagery in the streets of Libya, but you do say that you think that Mubarak and the Tunisians and Jordanians have to reform, then what you're essentially saying, whether you meant to or not, and they didn't mean to, is to the degree that you do not like the United States, you butcher lots of people and you keep the press from watching it, we're indifferent, or perhaps we're even supportive. To the degree that you like us, you bring in the cameras, and you're pretty soft about the way you put down, then we're going to be very angry at you. And it makes no sense. And so they need to go back and reset diplomacy and have a principled position that is not contingent on individual countries or personalities, but is more abstract.
Your Secretary of State, what should the American policy be?
The American policy, in my judgment, should have been rooted in the great tradition that began with Harry Truman in 1947, who said that it would be in the wake of communist conquests in Eastern Europe, who said that it'll be the policy of the United States government to promote the conditions of freedom everywhere around the world, a policy that was reaffirmed by Ronald Reagan in his great Westminster speech, in which he outlined the conditions under which freedom flourished, which had to do with a strong civil society and freedom of press and independent judiciary, and was then reaffirmed by George Bush in 2003 at his great NEH speech, when he announced the Freedom Agenda, became the first president to say, now the Freedom Agenda, which is a policy of the United States, must focus on the Arab Muslim world. That should have been our policy, but the Obama administration has systematically distanced itself from the Freedom Agenda.
Worth noting that the first president you named was Harry Truman, a Democrat. This can be a bipartisan policy.
It's an excellent point, and it has bipartisan roots.
Last question, a hard one, I think. Two quotations. Quotation one, political scientist Paul Ray, quote, "I believe we're witnessing a strategic shift in the Mediterranean. The younger generation of Arabs is turning to the only cultural force that has purchase in the post-Cold War world. They are turning to Islam. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Bahrain will become more hostile to us, to our European allies, and of course, to Israel." Close quote. Quotation two, Natan Sharansky, "The democracy that hates you is better than the dictator who loves you." Close quote. Victor, who's right?
Well, it's a little bit more complex because we have two theocratic regimes that give everybody as much Islam as they can handle. And one of them is the Sunni version in Saudi Arabia, and one is the Shia version in Iran, and neither one of them is popular. And there are people protesting both because they are authoritarian and corrupt, and they don't see that life is so good under the Quran. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do you warn people who are throwing off military dictatorships and secular strongmen and say to them, this is the path to consensuality, because if you really want the Muslim Brotherhood and you want theocracy, you've got two good examples, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the people there are not happy. And so I think that this is the Arabs' moment. I just would finish by saying, for 50 years we've been told by the Arab street, and its intellectuals, especially in Europe, that they brought the Baathists to us. They put Nazis into us in the 30s. They brought the Soviet-style paradigm. They brought the corrupt American dictatorship. All these isms and ologies were forced on us, and we didn't have any choice.
The Arabs said
yes.
This.
You go to Libya, and somebody will tell you, you put Gaddafi on. Somebody will tell you, you put the Khomeini on.
This persistent sense of victimhood.
Exactly, victim. Now everybody realizes this is their moment. This is grassroots. The world is watching. You guys don't have to put theocracy, monarchy. It's yours, and we'll see what the aspirations of the Arab people are, because everybody's staying out of it, and it's up to them to make a government that reflects what the people want, and we will see what the people want.
Peter?
Neither Sharansky or Ray is right, but there's a kernel of truth in each. You need to put them together. Contrary to Paul Ray, there are two forces that have purchase on people's souls in the contemporary Middle East. One force, as Paul Ray says, is Islam. But the other force, it is a real force, it also has purchase on people's souls, is what Natan Sharansky writes about. It's the spirit of democracy, the desire to be free, the desire to live under laws that you yourself have a hand in making, is to call the shots for yourself. The question is, which of these two is going to be the victor? We don't know which is going to be the victor. Therefore, we should pursue things in the spirit of Truman, Reagan, and Bush, and what we should work on is not in the first place getting elections up and running whose results can be not just uncertain but quite hostile to our interests and to international order. What we should work on is promoting, but with care, with caution, with judiciousness, the conditions under which freedom furnishes. That means helping people who want freedom to build independent judiciaries, expand the freedoms of the press, create economic opportunity, and certainly not least, extremely important, improve the opportunities for girls to be educated and for the protection of women's rights. That's what we can do to make things better.
Peter Berkowitz, Victor Davis Hanson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.